All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 27, Section 2, the Home Front. So last section, we talked about the outbreak of World War II and how the United States became involved. And of course, after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack on the U.S. naval base, the United States was now fully committed to the Second World War. And so in order to fight against Japan and fight against Germany, the United States required mobilization. Mobilization is the process by which you get ready to fight a conflict. This meant economic production, so factories shifted from peacetime to wartime production. This led to many new job opportunities. And at the time, the United States was experiencing the Great Depression. And it's typically said that World War II ended the Depression because of all the jobs that were now available. You know, during the Depression years, unemployment was at sometimes as high as 25%. During the Second World War, when there was so much wartime production that was, necessary and required, unemployment virtually evaporated. Anybody who wanted a job could find a job because not only was wartime production geared towards helping the U.S. military, but American supplies went to Great Britain, they went to the Soviet Union, they went to all sorts of different allies around the world. It's also true that while wartime production did ramp up, that corporate profits increased dramatically. So war was good for business. Now, money is one requirement that you need in order to fight a war. The other one is soldiers or manpower, and a lot of different Americans served in World War II. World War II witnessed the first peacetime draft in American history. So this was the first one in U.S. history. This was before Pearl Harbor, about 1940, when things were looking really bad for the Allied nations, Great Britain in particular. This just kind of goes to show that, the United States was gearing up or preparing for war, even though it had not yet been declared. All sorts of different Americans served in the war, rich, poor, young, old. African Americans served. However, there were segregated units, that is white and black soldiers fought separately. And also famed African-American pilots from the Tuskegee Institute. This was, of course, a school that was created by Booker T. Washington, but the Tuskegee Airmen, as they called them, trained, what do you want to call it, airplane pilots who saw action in World War II, right? So the Tuskegee Airmen who trained at the Tuskegee Institute were African-American pilots who served in World War II fighting in Italy. Native Americans also served in the war in a lot of different capacities, but one notable contribution was the Navajo code talkers. These were Native Americans who used the Navajo language to communicate, which didn't allow for the Axis nations of Japan or Germany to know what the United States was doing. So this was a way to secretly communicate. The Selective Service Act, this is a law, right? This is the draft, like we mentioned before, even following Pearl Harbor, which required even more people to get signed up for the military. Although you did have a number of conscientious objectors, or called COs. These are people who really refused to join the armed forces. They weren't necessarily objecting on any sort of belief that the war itself was immoral, but more so for their own personal reasons. They often served as non-combats in the war, so they can still assist to the war effort, but maybe their religious views didn't allow them to go out and shoot or kill another person. Who was going to lead the U.S. Army? Well, Dwight D. Eisenhower. So he would be in charge of lead U.S. and eventually Allied forces in Europe. Right, and this is Dwight D. Eisenhower right here. The war itself had a pretty big impact at home, a lot more so than World War I, in fact, World War II. And so, it caused migrations within the country. And so the United States sort of shifted itself in some ways. So, for example, the Defense Plant Corporation, this built war factories in places like, we'll say the West. But, really cities like Los Angeles, which before World War II was, not a very popular city. Because of the war and because a lot of the war-related industries were built out west, Los Angeles, Oakland, a lot of people ended up moving out west. And so it sort of helped shift the population further westward, the war did. The Office of Price Administration, or OPA, would regulate, as you might imagine, prices. People were encouraged to grow victory gardens, grow your own food. And to ration, that means don't take excess. And of course, all these things was in the name of making sure there is enough supplies for the soldiers. All right. So you see some propaganda here, plant a victory garden. So, this was even further measures that the government was willing to take to ensure that the economy was geared in the proper way so the United States should succeed. Like we mentioned before, the war itself provided new opportunities, but also specifically for women. Many women entered into defense jobs, which had traditionally been male-dominated. So, breaking the barriers of gender stereotypes and gender norms, World War II helped break down. Rosie the Riveter is the iconic, and interestingly enough, your book doesn't have a picture of Rosie the Riveter, but this was sort of an icon of propaganda, demonstrating the breaking down of gender barriers when it came to traditionally male jobs in the workplace. But there were also other laws that were passed to make things a little bit more easier on women during the war. The Community Facilities Act helped out with things like childcare. Women served in a number of different capacities as nurses, drivers, repairwomen, pilots. These were all jobs that women occupied during the war. Now, even though when the war ended, a lot of these women were forced out of those positions, World War II, at the very least, proved that women could do those positions when called upon and when necessary. The war even went so far as to affect culture, spelled correctly. That is the way that Americans think. Films were a big way of kind of encouraging Americans to do their patriotic duty. Why We Fight, for example, would be something like a propaganda film. Although I'd say that the need for propaganda in World War II was much less, considering the way that the U.S. became involved. Most Americans were ready to participate in the war effort because of the way that Japan had attacked the United States in a very unprovoked manner. And while there was certain propaganda that was created, really convincing the American population was not as necessary as it was before. John Wayne, for example, he was a famous actor that appeared in many of these films. Josephine Baker, she was a singer who would entertain the troops. And all of these things were more geared towards the war effort. Again, kind of this all falls under the thing of culture and entertainment. Lastly, at home, even though the United States was more unified around this conflict, there were still some social tensions at home. First, we'll talk about civil rights with African Americans. And one was that this was still a time of the Jim Crow South. You still had segregation in the South, despite all of the reasons for why the United States was fighting against, fascism in Germany. A. Philip Randolph, a civil rights leader, organized a March on Washington, which was a protest. He more or less was demanding equal recognition when it came to employment. Typically African Americans were paid less than their white counterparts. There were a lot of industries that simply just refused to hire African Americans. And this was, in fact, this March on Washington, or this threat of a protest, was so alarming for Franklin Roosevelt, who you might also say was maybe a little bit sympathetic to the cause of civil rights, certainly wasn't breaking down any barriers at the time, but may have had his own personal sympathies, forced him to pass Executive Order 8802, which prohibited segregation, actually discrimination, in the war industries. In other words, what did Executive Order 8802 do? Well, it said that if there was a business and that business received a government contract because they were producing war supplies, then that business could not deny African Americans a job, right? So this was a way to tackle the problem of employment and race in the country, and was breaking down these barriers. Executive Order 8802 lasts for the duration of the war. After the war is over, there's a lot more mounted resistance against it, but this was a way for the president to prevent any sort of problem between whites and blacks in the workplace from hindering what was ultimately the goal, that was the war effort. Organizations like the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, are founded in the 1940s. They initiate the Double V campaign. V stands for victory. And this was the purpose of the war. What did the war mean for African Americans? Well, it meant victory in the war, because even though the United States was a nation that treated African Americans as second-class citizens, it stood nowhere really in comparison with nations like Germany and their racial policies. So making sure the United States wins the war is an important thing, but also it meant victory against racism at home. That there was still going to be a lot of work to do, even if the U.S. won World War II, at home with tackling things like Jim Crow and discrimination. And that's not to say that all, like I mentioned before, during the war, not the entire country was united. You did have some riots that occurred, the Zoot Suit riots. This occurred in Los Angeles. And this revealed the tension between what we might call the Anglo and the Mexican population in LA. During World War II, the Bracerio program brought Mexican workers into the U.S. So you already had some ethnic tension between these two constituencies in places like LA. A zoot suit is a style of clothing that is very baggy. It's very large. It's kind of like what the old school gangsters used to wear, Al Capone and stuff like that. However, and it was a very popular fashion choice among young Mexican men to wear these zoot suits like the gangsters. However, World War II was a time when people were being asked to ration clothing, and so this sort of style of attire served as the catalyst for these riots, which witnessed members of the U.S. Navy roaming around Los Angeles looking for young Mexican men wearing long clothing, wearing the zoot suits, and beating them up and tearing off their clothes. The idea was during the war you were supposed to ration clothing, and so if you're wearing too much of it, right, if you're wearing an oversized suit, that was being viewed as being unpatriotic. Ultimately, the riots, so this is a style of clothing. The riots came to an end when members of the Navy were shipped and escorted out of LA, and ultimately clothing styles like the zoot suits were banned. So despite the fact there's more unity, I would say, in the Second World War than the First, there still is not a complete unity. That ethnic tensions are still certainly there in the United States. Lastly, though, and probably the biggest encroachment upon civil rights during World War II was the internment of Japanese citizens. Recall that Japan had attacked the United States, and so there was great fear that anyone who was Japanese or of Japanese ancestry might be loyal to Japan rather than being loyal to the United States. And so Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which more or less transformed the West Coast into a battleground. the west coast of the United States was officially labeled kind of like a war zone. That might be a more appropriate term there. And because it was a war zone, typical civil rights did not apply. And U.S. generals there ordered Japanese citizens, right, people of Japanese descent, to be relocated in camps, right, relocated, to pack your bags and move to these camps, essentially these prisons, where you can be watched and supervised, and so that you won't be conspiring with the enemy. And tens of thousands of Japanese packed their bags and left for these camps during the war year. The camps themselves were pretty poor condition. Things could be pretty rough, but they were certainly trapped in these camps like prisons with guard towers and everything else. The thing that made Japanese internment different than any other kind of war-related espionage is that none of these individuals were given a fair trial. This was a violation of, I believe it's the Sixth Amendment, the right to a fair trial. They were simply guilty just for being Japanese. Despite the fact you did have a number of Japanese Americans who served in the military, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. These were Japanese soldiers. I guess probably Japanese American soldiers, you would call them. And one of the most decorated regiments after or in all the war. Adversarial program, we also already talked about that. So when we look at the Second World War, yes, we generally consider World War II to be the war that united the American population, but we have to recall that, well, for African Americans, it wasn't completely that story. You had ethnic conflicts in the West between Anglo and Mexican American populations, and especially for the Japanese. Those who were interned were certainly not protected of their American rights.